Welcome to the deep dive.
Red Day.
We're taking you on a journey through Tiqqun's the Cybernetic Hypothesis.
You've given us quite the reading list, not just the hypothesis itself, but also works from the Invisible Committee, like the coming insurrection.
And to our friends.
Clearly you're interested in seeing how these radical thinkers intersect, and we're here to guide you.
What's immediately striking about the Cybernetic Hypothesis is its ambition. Tiqqun isn't simply critiquing technology. They're aiming to expose the very logic of power in our age. Their central argument is that the convergence of state and market has created a new system of control, a cybernetic system.
So let's define cybernetics right off the bat.
It's a term thrown around a lot.
Often with a kind of sci-fi gloss.
But Tiqqun is drawing on a specific lineage of thought.
They trace cybernetics back to its origins in the mid-20th century, with figures like Norbert Wiener. Initially, it was about control systems, feedback loops, the kind of mechanisms you'd find in engineering, but cybernetics quickly expanded to encompass social systems. Thinkers like Gregory Bateson started applying these concepts to communication, anthropology, even psychology.
And that's where Tiqqun picks up the thread, right?
They're interested in how cybernetics has become a mode of social control.
Precisely. For Tiqqun, the cybernetic hypothesis goes something like this. The state and market, in their pursuit of total control, have created a system that no longer relies primarily on brute force. Instead, it operates through subtle manipulation, through what they call devices.
Let's unpack this idea of devices.
Because it's not just about surveillance cameras.
Like our algorithms. Right. Devices for Tiqqun are anything that reinforces the cybernetic system. It could be a piece of technology, yes, but it could also be a social norm, a psychological technique, even a way of speaking. The key is that these devices operate in a decentralized, almost invisible way, shaping our behavior without us even realizing it.
So the control becomes internalized.
We become our own prison guards, so to speak.
Exactly. Tiqqun argues that the goal of the cybernetic system is to produce a self-disciplined personality. An individual who polices themselves, who internalizes the norms and expectations of the system.
And this is where Tiqqun starts to get really interesting. They claim this cybernetic hypothesis is not just a theory.
It's the dominant mode of power today.
They go so far as to say that the quick reestablishment of balance requires that inconsistencies be detected at the very location where they are produced, and that corrective action takes place in a decentralized manner. This is how the cybernetic system maintains stability, not through top-down authority, but through constant, localized adjustments.
Almost like a self-regulating organism, right?
Each individual, through their interactions with these devices, contributes to maintaining the equilibrium of the whole.
Precisely. And this leads to a profound sense of alienation, what Tiqqun calls bloom. They describe bloom as spectral, wandering, sovereignly vacant humanity. He's the product of this cybernetic control, adrift in a world that no longer makes sense.
Now, to understand Bloom, it's helpful to look at how Tiqqun describes him in their other work.
They talk about this feeling of not himself, this internal presence of the other that dictates his thoughts and actions.
And this other is essentially the embodiment of the cybernetic system working within the individual. It's the voice of control, the internalized gaze that keeps Bloom in line.
There are clear echoes here of what the Invisible Committee describes to our friends.
The erosion of meaning, the pervasiveness of lies, the sense of being trapped in a world that's been emptied of substance.
Absolutely. Both Tiqqun and the Invisible Committee are grappling with the same problem. How power operates in the age of information, and how it shapes our very subjectivity.
Tiqqun puts it starkly. Under cybernetic control, each person was to become a fleshless envelope, the best possible conductor of social communication, the locus of an infinite feedback loop, which is made to have no nodes. It's a chilling image of being reduced to pure data, a node in a network that has no center, no purpose.
And this leads us to the central question. If we're caught in this web of cybernetic control, how do we resist?
Tiqqun doesn't offer easy answers.
But they do introduce the concept of the imaginary party, a kind of anti-cybernetic force operating outside the traditional political framework.
The imaginary party is not a party in the conventional sense. It has no platform, no leaders, no membership cards. It's more of a concept, a potentiality that emerges from the cracks in the cybernetic system.
Tiqqun is careful to distinguish the imaginary party from the kinds of social movements they critique.
Remember, for them, these movements are often characterized by a volatile sociality, constantly shifting and ultimately unable to challenge the system.
They write, there has been in all the social movements up till now a commitment not to seize what is here, which explains why they follow each other without ever becoming a force, like a succession of breaking waves. They're suggesting that these movements are ultimately co-opted by the cybernetic system. Their energy safely channeled into forms of protest that reinforce the status quo.
So the imaginary party is about something different.
Something more radical. It's about creating a break, a rupture, a space outside the logic of control.
Precisely. And this is where the Invisible Committee's ideas become relevant. In the coming insurrection, they talk about the need for destitution, for creating autonomous zones where new forms of life can flourish.
And in To Our Friends, they emphasize the importance of offensive opacity, of short-circuiting the feedback loops that keep the cybernetic system running.
Both groups are pointing toward the same goal, creating spaces of resistance, spaces where the logic of control breaks down, where new possibilities can emerge.
So let's dive into the first chapter of the Cybernetic Hypothesis and see how Tiqqun lays out their argument. They start by describing this convergence of state and market power.
As a kind of program.
What do they mean by this?
They're suggesting that this convergence isn't accidental. It's a deliberate project, a program aimed at creating a certain kind of citizen.
A citizen who is perfectly integrated into the cybernetic system.
A citizen who willingly participates in their own subjugation.
Exactly. And Tiqqun sees this program as being both insidious and totalizing, extending its reach into every aspect of our lives.
They write that from now on, everyone knows that without the concrete help of citizens, the state will have neither the means nor the time to carry on the work that can prevent our society from exploding. It's almost like the state is blackmailing us into compliance, making us feel responsible for preventing societal collapse.
Yes, and Tiqqun sees this as a key tactic of the cybernetic system. It fosters a sense of dependence, making us believe that we need the system to survive.
But Tiqqun also points to a more subtle form of co-optation. They identify a new global cultural left that they believe is actually complicit in this program of control.
They write that this new left is the idealistic side of imperial modernization, providing a necessary steam valve to the unbearable pace of capitalism.
So instead of challenging the system, this new left actually helps to perpetuate it. They offer kind of safe dissent, channeling potential resistance into forms that ultimately pose no threat.
Precisely. Tiqqun sees this as a deliberate strategy on the part of the state and market forces to maintain control. They co-opt and neutralize dissent, absorbing it into the system itself.
And this leads us back to the concept of social movements. Tiqqun argues that these movements, despite their good intentions, are often characterized by a kind of volatile sociality that prevents them from achieving lasting change.
They write that there has been, in all the social movements up till now, a commitment not to seize what is here, which explains why they follow each other without ever becoming a force, like a succession of breaking waves.
It's a powerful image.
These movements rise and crash, expending their energy without ever truly transforming the underlying conditions that created them.
And Tiqqun sees this as a deliberate strategy on the part of the state and market forces to maintain control. They allow these movements to exist, even encourage them, because they ultimately pose no real threat.
Tiqqun writes that the very expression social movement seems to suggest that what really matters is what we are heading towards, and not what happens here. They're critiquing the tendency of these movements to focus on abstract goals and ideologies rather than on the concrete realities of the present moment.
And this detachment from the here and now, they argue, is what ultimately renders these movements ineffective.
So for Tiqqun, the imaginary party represents a different kind of political force. It's not about joining a movement. It's about creating a break, a rupture, a space outside the logic of the cybernetic system.
It's about becoming ungovernable, refusing to participate in the system's game. And this brings us to the second chapter of the Cybernetic Hypothesis, where Tiqqun delves deeper into the figure of Bloom and introduces a new character, the young girl.
This is where their analysis starts to get really interesting. And I'm eager to see how they connect these figures to the broader dynamics of cybernetic control.
Tiqqun starts chapter 2 with a provocative statement. They write, there is no longer any proletariat. This isn't a denial of class struggle, but rather a recognition that the traditional categories of Marxist analysis no longer adequately capture the dynamics of power in the cybernetic age.
So they're suggesting that the cybernetic system has created a new form of exploitation, one that transcends traditional class divisions.
Exactly. And this is where the figure of Bloom becomes crucial. Bloom, they argue, is the product of this new form of exploitation, the quintessential subject of the cybernetic age.
They describe him as the figure of the dispossessed, someone who has been stripped of his social identity, his history, his very sense of self.
Bloom is adrift in a world of empty signs and simulations, unable to find meaning or purpose.
And yet Tiqqun argues Bloom is not simply a victim. He is also complicit in his own exploitation, willingly participating in the system that is destroying him.
They write, Bloom is not the man who has nothing, but the man who has nothing left to lose. This suggests that Bloom has reached a point of nihilistic detachment, a point where he no longer cares about the consequences of his actions.
And this detachment, this apathy, is precisely what makes him so valuable to the cybernetic system.
Bloom is the perfect consumer, the perfect worker, the perfect citizen. He is completely malleable, completely controllable, completely predictable.
But Tiqqun also introduces another figure in this chapter, the young girl. And they're careful to distinguish her from Bloom.
They write, the young girl is not Bloom. She is a specific manifestation of Bloom, within the cybernetic system, playing a particular role in reinforcing its control.
They describe her as the proof and prop of the unlimited pursuit of the valuation process when the accumulation process itself is found wanting due to the insufficiency of the planet, ecological catastrophe, or social implosion.
In other words, the young girl emerges as a response to the crises of capitalism, a new frontier of value creation in a system that is facing limits to its growth.
She is the embodiment of consumerist desire, constantly seeking new objects and experiences to fill the void within her.
And this desire, Tiqqun argues, is carefully cultivated by the cybernetic system. The young girl is bombarded with images and messages that reinforce her need to consume, to acquire, to experience.
They write, the young girl's only worry is being plugged in everywhere. This suggests that she is constantly seeking validation and affirmation from the outside world, desperately trying to fill the void within her through external means.
And this makes her the perfect target for the cybernetic system's manipulations. She is easily seduced by the promise of happiness and fulfillment that consumer society offers.
But Tiqqun argues this promise is ultimately empty. The young girl's pursuit of pleasure and consumption leads only to further alienation and dissatisfaction.
They write, sexual misery is born from the impossible coincidence of enjoyment and value. In other words, the young girl's attempt to find happiness through consumption is doomed to failure, as the objects of her desire are ultimately empty and meaningless.
So both Bloom and the young girl represent different facets of the cybernetic system's control. Bloom embodies the nihilistic detachment and apathy of the system's subjects, while the young girl embodies the insatiable desire and consumerism that fuel its engine.
Exactly. And this brings us to Chapter 3, where Tiqqun introduces the concept of the imaginary party as a potential site of resistance to this system of control.
This is where their analysis starts to take a more explicitly political turn. They're moving beyond critique and diagnosis and starting to explore the possibilities for collective action.
Tiqqun begins Chapter 3 by acknowledging the difficulty of resisting the cybernetic system. They write, to speak of a possible insurrection against the cybernetic hypothesis is already to commit a category error.
So they're acknowledging that traditional forms of resistance, based on the model of class struggle or political revolution, are unlikely to be effective against this new form of power.
Exactly. The cybernetic system is too diffuse, too adaptable, too deeply embedded in the fabric of our lives to be overthrown through traditional means.
So what do they propose instead?
Tiqqun argues that resistance must take a different form. It must be more subtle, more diffuse, more attuned to the specific dynamics of the cybernetic system.
And this is where the concept of the imaginary party comes in. But as you've pointed out, this is not a party in the traditional sense.
It has no platform, no leaders, no membership cards. It's more of a concept, potentiality, a space of possibility that exists outside the logic of the cybernetic system.
Tiqqun describes it as a metaphysical community, a gathering of those who refuse to be governed by the system's dictates.
They write, the imaginary party is the other name for the shameful sickness of power when it has been weakened. Paranoia.
So they're suggesting that the cybernetic system, despite its apparent power, is actually quite fragile, quite vulnerable to disruption.
And this paranoia, this fear of destabilization, manifests in the system's constant attempts to control and monitor every aspect of our lives.
They write, each individual act of destruction constitutes an act of terrorism. That is, it objectively attacks the whole of society. This suggests that the cybernetic system sees any act of resistance, no matter how small, as a threat to its existence.
Exactly. And this is why Tiqqun argues that resistance must be subtle, diffuse, almost invisible.
It must operate on the margins of the system, exploiting its vulnerabilities, disrupting its flows of information and control.
They write, the invisible revolt and diffuse guerrilla war do not sanction injustices, they create a possible world. This suggests that the imaginary party is not simply about fighting against the cybernetic system, but about creating something new, a different way of life, a different way of being in the world.
So the imaginary party is not a blueprint for revolution, but rather a call to experimentation, to creativity, to finding new and unexpected ways to resist the system's control.
Exactly. And this is where Tiqqun's analysis intersects with the Invisible Committee's ideas about destitution, autonomy, and offensive opacity.
Both groups are pointing toward the same goal: the creation of spaces and practices that exist outside the logic of the cybernetic system, spaces where new forms of life and community can flourish.
And these spaces, Tiqqun argues, are already emerging all around us. They write, the imaginary party, above all, refers only to the positive fact of this multitude of autonomous zones, free from commodity domination, which are experiencing here and now beyond the reach of the deterioration of the alienated common and the last death throes of a perishing social organism, their own forms of publicity.
So they're suggesting that the seeds of resistance are already being sown, that a new world is already being born within the shell of the old.
Exactly. And this brings us to Chapter 4, where Tiqqun delves deeper into the specific tactics and strategies that the imaginary party can employ to resist the cybernetic system.
I'm eager to see how they move from the theoretical to the practical, from the realm of concepts to the realm of action.
Tiqqun opens Chapter 4 with the provocative statement. They write, the cybernetic hypothesis has engendered its own metaphysics.
This suggests that the cybernetic system is not simply a set of technologies and institutions, but also a way of seeing the world, a way of understanding our place within it.
So they're suggesting that the cybernetic system has its own ideology, its own set of beliefs and values that shape our thoughts and actions.
And this metaphysics, Tiqqun argues, is based on the principles of control, efficiency, and predictability.
The cybernetic system seeks to order and regulate every aspect of our lives, from the way we work to the way we consume to the way we relate to each other.
And this, Tiqqun argues, is what makes it so dangerous. It closes down possibilities, it stifles creativity, it reduces us to mere cogs in the machine.
So how do they propose to resist this metaphysical colonization?
Tiqqun argues that the imaginary party must develop its own counter-metaphysics, a different way of seeing the world, a different set of values and principles.
And this counter-metaphysics, they argue, must be based on the principles of autonomy, spontaneity, and play.
They write, play is the only adequate response to the cybernetic hypothesis. This suggests that the imaginary party must find ways to disrupt the system's logic, to introduce elements of chaos and unpredictability into its carefully ordered world.
So they're not talking about traditional forms of political action like protests or demonstrations.
No, they're talking about something more subtle, more subversive, more attuned to the specific dynamics of the cybernetic system.
They write, the imaginary party does not oppose the cybernetic hypothesis with another hypothesis, but with forms of life. This suggests that resistance must be embodied, it must be lived, it must be expressed in the way we conduct ourselves in the world.
Exactly. And these forms of life, Tiqqun argues, are already emerging all around us, in the cracks and fissures of the cybernetic system.
They write, the imaginary party is the party of those who have nothing to lose but their chains. This suggests that the imaginary party is open to anyone who is willing to break free from the system's control, anyone who is willing to embrace a different way of life.
And this brings us to Chapter 5, where Tiqqun delves deeper into the specific tactics and strategies that the imaginary party can employ to resist the cybernetic system.
I'm eager to see how they move from the theoretical to the practical, from the realm of concepts to the realm of action.
Tiqqun opens Chapter 5 with a stark assessment of the contemporary political landscape. They write, the historical period we are entering must be one of extreme violence and great disorder.
So they're not offering a utopian vision of peaceful revolution. They're recognizing that the struggle against the cybernetic system will be long and difficult.
Exactly. And this is why they argue that the imaginary party must be prepared to use violence if necessary.
But they're careful to distinguish between different forms of violence. They write, there is a world of difference between the violence of the oppressor and the violence of the oppressed.
They're suggesting that the violence of the cybernetic system is a violence of control, a violence that seeks to maintain the status quo, to suppress dissent, to crush any challenge to its authority.
Whereas the violence of the imaginary party is a violence of liberation, a violence that seeks to break the chains of oppression, to create a new world, to build a better future.
Exactly. And this distinction is crucial, Tiqqun argues, because it helps us to understand the ethical dimensions of the struggle against the cybernetic system.
They're not advocating for a mindless or indiscriminate use of violence. They're arguing that violence can be a legitimate tool of resistance, but only when it is used in a targeted and strategic way, and only when it is guided by a clear ethical framework.
And this ethical framework, they argue, must be based on the principles of justice, solidarity, and the recognition of the inherent dignity of all human beings.
So they're not simply offering a blueprint for revolution. They're also offering a vision of a different kind of society, a society that is based on different values and principles.
Exactly. And this brings us to Chapter 6, where Tiqqun explores the specific ways in which the imaginary party can create this different kind of society.
This is where their analysis becomes truly visionary, as they move beyond the critique of the present and begin to sketch out the contours of a possible future.
Tiqqun opens Chapter 6 with a call to action. They write, "What is required is the constitution of a plane of consistency, where all the gestures and words, all the acts and desires that are already practically opposed to the process of cybernetic totalization may be articulated."
So they're suggesting that the imaginary party is not something that needs to be created from scratch. It already exists in a nascent form in the countless acts of resistance that are taking place all over the world.
Exactly. The task of the imaginary party is not to invent new forms of resistance, but to connect and amplify the forms of resistance that are already emerging.
They write, the imaginary party is the network of those who refuse to be governed, the constellation of those who are building a new world within the shell of the old.
This suggests that the imaginary party is not a centralized organization, but a decentralized network of individuals and groups who are united by their shared opposition to the cybernetic system.
And this network, Tiqqun argues, operates according to a different logic than the cybernetic system. It is based on the principles of autonomy, solidarity, and mutual aid.
They write, "The imaginary party is the party of the commons, the party of those who are creating a new world based on the principles of sharing, cooperation, and direct democracy."
So they're offering a vision of a society that is radically different from the one we live in now. A society that is not based on competition, exploitation, and control, but on collaboration, mutual respect, and the free exchange of ideas and resources.
Exactly. And this vision, Tiqqun argues, is not simply a utopian dream. It is a concrete possibility. A possibility that is being realized in the countless acts of resistance that are taking place all over the world.
They write, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed."
This suggests that the seeds of a new world are already being sown, that the imaginary party is already creating pockets of freedom and autonomy within the heart of the cybernetic system.
And these pockets of freedom, Tiqqun argues, are not simply isolated enclaves. They are connected to each other, forming a network of resistance that spans the globe.
They're right. The imaginary party is a global phenomenon, a planetary network of those who are fighting for a better world.
So they're suggesting that the struggle against the cybernetic system is not a local or regional struggle. It is a global struggle, a struggle that requires us to connect with and support each other across borders and cultures.
Exactly. And this brings us to the concluding chapter of the Cybernetic Hypothesis, where Tiqqun offers some final thoughts on the nature of the imaginary party and its potential to transform the world.
This is where their analysis reaches its culmination, as they attempt to synthesize their arguments into a coherent vision of the future.
Tiqqun opens the concluding chapter with a provocative statement. They write, the imaginary party is the party of the future.
This suggests that they see the imaginary party as the only force that is capable of challenging the cybernetic system and creating a new world.
Exactly. And this is because, Tiqqun argues, the imaginary party understands the true nature of the cybernetic system. It understands that the cybernetic system is not simply a set of technologies and institutions, but a way of seeing the world, a way of understanding our place within it.
They write, the cybernetic hypothesis has engendered its own metaphysics, its own way of seeing the world, its own set of values and principles.
And this metaphysics, Tiqqun argues, is based on the principles of control, efficiency, and predictability.
The cybernetic system seeks to order and regulate every aspect of our lives, from the way we work to the way we consume to the way we relate to each other.
And this, Tiqqun argues, is what makes it so dangerous. It closes down possibilities, it stifles creativity, it reduces us to mere cogs in the machine.
Good. So how does Tiqqun propose that we resist this metaphysical colonization?
They argue that the imaginary party must develop its own counter-metaphysics, a different way of seeing the world, a different set of values and principles.
And this counter-metaphysics, they argue, must be based on the principles of autonomy, spontaneity, and play.
They write, play is the only adequate response to the cybernetic hypothesis. This suggests that the imaginary party must find ways to disrupt the system's logic, to introduce elements of chaos and unpredictability into its carefully ordered world.
So Tiqqun is suggesting that we must embrace the unpredictable, the spontaneous, the creative. We must resist the urge to control and order every aspect of our lives.
Exactly. And this is what it means to be part of the imaginary party. It means embracing a different way of life, a way of life that is based on the principles of freedom, autonomy, and mutual respect.
It means creating spaces and practices that exist outside the logic of the cybernetic system, spaces where new forms of life and community can flourish.
And this is a difficult task, no doubt. But it is a necessary task, Tiqqun argues, if we are to create a better world.
So if Tiqqun's the cybernetic hypothesis is right, that the system we live in is not just about technology but a deeper logic of control, then their answer, the imaginary party, isn't about forming a traditional political group. It's a challenge to fundamentally shift how we understand ourselves and the world around us.
We encourage you, our listener, to consider what ungovernability might look like in your own life. What small acts of resistance can you engage in? Where can you find or create those zones of offensive opacity, those spaces where the cybernetic logic breaks down?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Tiqqun's thought-provoking work. It's not a comfortable journey, but as we've seen, discomfort can be the breeding ground for new possibilities. Until next time, keep questioning, keep resisting, keep creating.